My name is Jessica Chen. I'm 29, and the moment I saw my bank balance drop to zero, I knew my family had just signed their own death warrant. The notification popped up on my phone during my lunch break at Phoenix General Hospital, and I nearly choked on my sandwich. $42,000. Gone. Just like that. My entire life savings, the money I'd been squirreling away for 5 years to buy my first house, had vanished overnight. But this wasn't some bank error or identity theft. This was so much worse. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This was my own parents, Robert and Linda Chen, deciding that my sister Amanda's gambling addiction was more important than my future. They had access to my account because I'd trusted them during a medical emergency last year, and they'd just used that trust to fund my sister's latest casino binge. When I confronted them that evening at their ranch house in Tempe, my father actually had the nerve to look me in the eye and say, "Jessica, family comes first. You'll understand when you're older." I was standing by their pool, the Arizona sunset painting everything orange, and I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. I work as a registered nurse in the cardiac unit at Phoenix General Hospital, pulling 12-hour shifts that leave me exhausted but satisfied. There's something about helping people recover from heart surgery that gives my life meaning, even when the work is physically and emotionally draining. My apartment in Scottsdale isn't much to look at from the outside, just another beige complex in a city full of them, but it's mine. Or at least, it was going to be mine once I saved enough for a house down payment. Every month for the past 5 years, I'd been putting away $700 religiously, watching that number climb toward my goal of $50,000. I lived on rice and beans some weeks, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that made concerning noises, and hadn't taken a real vacation since nursing school. But it was worth it because I had a plan. My family never seemed to understand my methodical approach to life. My parents, Robert and Linda, had immigrated from Taiwan in the 80s and built a comfortable middle-class existence through hard work and careful saving. Dad worked as an engineer for a construction company, while Mom managed the books for a small chain of dry cleaners. They'd always preached the importance of family loyalty and financial responsibility, values that I'd taken to heart perhaps too seriously. My sister Amanda, 4 years older, and infinitely more charismatic, had always been the golden child who could do no wrong in their eyes. Where I was steady and reliable, Amanda was spontaneous and charming. Where I saved every penny, Amanda lived for the moment. Growing up, I'd watch her sweet-talk our parents out of grounding after staying out past curfew, while I'd get lectures for forgetting to take out the trash. Amanda had married young to a guy named Derek who worked in real estate, and for a while it seemed like she'd found her stability. They lived in a nice house in Chandler, drove matching BMWs, and Amanda worked as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup. But underneath the glossy surface, cracks were forming that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Derek traveled constantly for work, leaving Amanda alone with too much time and too little supervision. That's when the gambling started. Innocently enough, with office fantasy football leagues and weekend trips to Vegas with her girlfriends. But what began as harmless fun gradually evolved into something darker and more compulsive. The first sign of trouble came 3 years ago when Amanda called me crying, saying she'd lost $2,000 at Desert Diamond Casino and needed help before Derek found out. She promised it was a one-time mistake, that she'd learned her lesson and would never gamble again. Being the responsible younger sister, I lent her the money without question, believing her tears and her promises. She paid me back within a month, and I thought that was the end of it. But gambling addiction doesn't work that way. It's a progressive disease that feeds on itself, requiring bigger and bigger risks to achieve the same emotional high. What I didn't know then was that Amanda had already opened 3 different credit cards to fund her casino visits, and my $2,000 bailout had simply bought her time to dig herself deeper into debt. Over the next 2 years, the requests became more frequent and more desperate. Amanda would show up at my apartment at strange hours, sometimes still dressed in the cocktail dresses she wore to the casinos, makeup smeared and eyes red from crying. She'd spin elaborate stories about bad investments, unexpected medical bills, or car repairs to explain why she needed money. Each time, she'd swear on our grandmother's grave that this was the last time that she was getting help, that she understood how serious the problem had become. And each time, I'd transfer money from my carefully guarded savings account because I couldn't bear to see my sister suffer. The amounts grew progressively larger, from $500 to $2,000, then $5,000, then $8,000 for what she claimed was a debt consolidation loan. When he discovered the extent of her debts and the fact that she'd been forging his signature on loan applications, the divorce was messy and public, with Derek's lawyer painting Amanda as a pathological liar who'd manipulated their joint finances to feed her casino habit. Amanda moved back in with our parents temporarily, claiming she needed time to get back on her feet, but what she really needed was access to new sources of funding now that her credit cards were maxed out and Derek had cut her off financially. That's when my parents made the decision that would change everything between us. Unbeknownst to me, they'd been having private conversations with Amanda about her situation, and she'd convinced them that I was sitting on a pile of money while she's struggled to survive. She painted me as selfish and unsympathetic, someone who cared more about material possessions than family bonds. She told them that I'd refused to help her get back on her feet, which was completely false, but Amanda had always been skilled at twisting the truth to serve her purposes. In their minds, they were simply correcting an injustice, redistributing family resources to help the child who needed it most. What made their betrayal even more devastating was the fact that they had legitimate access to my savings account. The previous year, I'd been hospitalized for 3 days with a severe case of food poisoning that left me delirious and unable to handle my own affairs. In a moment of vulnerability, I'd given my parents temporary access to my checking and savings accounts so they could pay my bills and manage my finances while I recovered. It was supposed to be a short-term arrangement, but in the chaos of returning to work and catching up on my life, I'd never gotten around to removing their names from the accounts. It was an oversight born of trust, not carelessness, because I never imagined my own parents would abuse that access. The day I discovered the theft was a Tuesday in March, one of those perfect Phoenix days when the temperature hits 75 degrees and the sky is impossibly blue. I was working a particularly challenging shift in the cardiac unit, dealing with a patient who'd suffered complications after bypass surgery, when my phone buzzed with a banking notification. I almost ignored it, assuming it was just a routine update about a small purchase or automatic bill payment. But something made me glance at the screen, and when I saw the balance of $3.47, I thought there had to be a mistake. My hands were shaking as I opened my banking app, scrolling through the transaction history with growing horror. There it was, in black and white, a wire transfer of $42,000 to an account I didn't recognize, authorized with my parents' access credentials. The transaction had occurred at 9:30 that morning, while I was giving medications to patients and documenting their progress notes. In the time it took me to check someone's blood pressure and adjust their IV drip, my entire financial future had been stolen by the people who were supposed to love and protect me most. I had to excuse myself from patient care and lock myself in a supply closet just to breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in as the full implications of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just about money, though $42,000 represented 5 years of sacrifice and discipline. This was about trust, about the fundamental assumption that your family has your best interests at heart. I'd been raised to believe that blood was thicker than water, that family loyalty was sacred. But in that moment, I realized that my parents had chosen Amanda's immediate needs over my long-term well-being without even consulting me. The worst part was knowing that this money wouldn't actually help Amanda in any meaningful way. Giving an active gambling addict access to $42,000 is like pouring gasoline on a fire. Within weeks, maybe days, it would all be gone, fed into slot machines or lost at poker tables, and Amanda would be right back where she started, only now with the additional burden of having destroyed what remained of our family relationships. But addiction doesn't operate on logic or long-term thinking. It demands immediate gratification, and my parents had just provided.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Amanda with the biggest hit she'd ever experienced. I managed to finish my shift somehow, going through the motions of patient care, while my mind raced with questions and scenarios. Should I call the police and report the theft? Should I confront my parents immediately or wait until I'd had time to process what happened? Should I involve Amanda directly, or was this entirely between me and our parents? Every option seemed to lead to the same place, the complete destruction of my family as I'd known it. But as I drove home through the desert landscape that evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, I realized that my family had already been destroyed. I was just the last one to know about it. My apartment felt different when I walked in that night, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together while I was gone. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, knowing I had to make the call, but not sure I was ready for what would come next. When I finally dialed my parents' number, my mother answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful as if nothing had happened. "Jessica, how was work today, sweetheart?" she asked, and I could hear the television playing in the background, some Chinese drama she'd been following. "Mom, we need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "About my savings account. About the $42,000 that disappeared today." The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever, and I could hear her breathing change on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost all its warmth and taken on the defensive tone I remembered from childhood arguments. "Jessica, your father and I can explain everything," she said carefully. "It's not what you think. We were helping Amanda get back on her feet, and we knew you'd want to help if you understood the situation." The casual way she said it, as if stealing my life savings was a reasonable thing to do, made my blood pressure spike. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples as I struggled to find words that wouldn't result in me saying something I couldn't take back. "You took $42,000 from my account without asking me," I said slowly, initiating each word clearly. "You stole my money to enable Amanda's gambling addiction. How is that helping anyone?" My mother's response was immediate and predictable, launching into a litany of excuses about Amanda's difficult divorce, her emotional struggles, and her need for family support during a challenging time. She painted Amanda as a victim of circumstances, conveniently omitting any mention of Amanda's own choices or role in earlier family conflicts. Mention of the gambling addiction that had caused those circumstances in the first place. "Your sister is going through a rough time," Mom continued, her voice taking on the guilt-inducing tone she'd perfected over the years. "She needed our help, and we knew you'd understand once you thought about it. Family takes care of family, Jessica. That's how we raised you." The implication was clear, that my anger and upset were selfish reactions, that a truly good daughter would be happy to sacrifice her own financial security for her sister's immediate needs. But I wasn't the same compliant daughter who'd always deferred to my parents' judgment. 5 years of 12-hour nursing shifts, of living below my means and sacrificing immediate pleasures for long-term goals had given me a backbone I didn't know I possessed. "I want the money back," I said firmly. "All of it, by the end of the week. And I want Amanda to get real help for her gambling problem, not just another bailout that enables her addiction." My mother's response was swift and cutting. "Jessica Chen, you're being selfish and unreasonable," she said, using my full name the way she had when I was 7 years old and had refused to share my toys. "Amanda is your sister, and she needs this money more than you do. You have a good job, you'll make more money, but Amanda needs help right now, today. How can you be so cold-hearted toward your own family?" The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother alternating between guilt trips and accusations, painting me as the villain in a story where I was clearly the victim. She accused me of being materialistic, of caring more about money than family relationships, of being jealous of Amanda's charisma and success. Each accusation felt like a slap, not because they were true, but because they revealed how completely my mother had bought into Amanda's version of reality. When I finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained and physically exhausted. I'd expected my parents to be apologetic, to recognize that they'd crossed a line and work with me to make things right. Instead, they doubled down on their decision, making it clear that they saw me as the problem, not Amanda's addiction or their own theft. In their minds, they were the heroes of this story, the loving parents who'd sacrificed to help their struggling daughter, while I was the selfish sibling who cared more about money than family bonds. That night, I barely slept, tossing and turning as I replayed the conversation and tried to figure out my next steps. I kept thinking about all the things I'd given up to save that money. The dinners out I'd skipped, the vacations I'd postponed, the clothes I'd worn until they fell apart. I thought about the house I was planning to buy, the stability and independence it would have represented, and how all of that had been stolen from me by the people who were supposed to love me most. But mostly, I thought about Amanda and how this latest bailout would only make her addiction worse, not better. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let this stand, not just for my own sake, but for Amanda's as well. Enabling an addict doesn't help them recover. It just postpones the inevitable reckoning while making the eventual crash even more devastating. My parents thought they were showing love by giving Amanda access to my savings, but what they were really doing was feeding a disease that would ultimately destroy her if left unchecked. It was time for some tough love, even if it meant becoming the villain in my family story. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. I couldn't focus on patient care when my entire world had been turned upside down, and I knew my colleagues and patients deserved better than a distracted nurse who might make dangerous mistakes. Instead, I drove straight to Marcus Rodriguez's accounting office in downtown Phoenix, clutching a folder of bank statements and feeling like my legs might give out at any moment. Marcus had been my friend since college, one of those steady, analytical people who could look at any situation and cut through the emotional noise to find the practical solutions. If anyone could help me figure out how to handle this mess, it was him. Marcus's office was in one of those converted warehouse buildings that had been turned into trendy professional spaces, all exposed brick and industrial lighting. His receptionist, a kind older woman named Rosa, took one look at my face and immediately ushered me into his private office without bothering to check his appointment schedule. Marcus was behind his desk reviewing tax documents when I walked in, but he set everything aside the moment he saw my expression. He'd known me long enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong, and the careful way I was holding my folder of papers probably gave away the gravity of the situation. "Jess, you look like you've seen a ghost," he said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "What's going on?" I tried to start explaining calmly, but the words came out in a rush, everything spilling out at once about Amanda's gambling, my parents' betrayal, and the $42,000 that had vanished from my account. Marcus listened to me without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail I revealed. When I finally finished talking, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long whistle. "Jesus, Jess, your own parents cleaned out your savings?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "That's not just a family disagreement, that's straight up theft. You know that, right?" His words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been thinking the same thing. Hearing it spoken out loud by someone I trusted made it real in a way that my own internal thoughts hadn't managed to achieve. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a family dispute that could be resolved over Sunday dinner. This was a crime, and my parents were the perpetrators. Marcus spent the next hour going through my bank statements with the methodical precision that made him such a good accountant. He traced every transaction, noting patterns and asking detailed questions about my parents' access to the accounts. What he found wasn't pretty. Beyond the massive $42,000 withdrawal, there were smaller transfers over the past 6 months that I'd completely missed, amounts ranging from $500 to $2,000 that had been moved to accounts I didn't recognize. When Marcus added them up, the total came to nearly $7,000 additional dollars that had been siphoned from my savings without my knowledge or consent. "They've been doing this for a while, Jess," he said grimly, pointing to the pattern of transfers on his computer screen. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision to help Amanda. This was systematic, planned theft over an extended period. They were probably testing to see if you'd noticed the smaller amounts before they went for the big score."
The revelation made my stomach churn. It was one thing to think my parents had made a desperate, misguided decision in a moment of crisis. It was another thing entirely to realize they'd been slowly bleeding my accounts dry for months, calculating how much they could steal without triggering my attention. Marcus pulled up a legal database on his computer and started researching Arizona's laws regarding financial elder abuse and theft by family members. What he found wasn't encouraging from my parents' perspective, but it gave me a clear path forward if I chose to pursue it. Arizona treated theft by family members the same as theft by strangers when it came to criminal prosecution, and the amounts involved would qualify as felony charges if I decided to press them. The bank would be required to investigate once I filed a formal complaint, and they'd have to cooperate with law enforcement if criminal charges were filed. Here's what we're looking at, Marcus explained, turning his screen so I could see the relevant statutes. Grand theft in the first degree, potentially conspiracy charges if they plan this together, and possibly elder financial abuse depending on how the prosecutor wants to frame it. Your parents could be looking at serious jail time, Jess. Are you prepared for that? The question hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. Was I prepared to send my own parents to prison over money? Was I prepared to be the daughter who destroyed her family over financial disagreements? But then I thought about Amanda, probably at some casino right now, feeding my life savings into slot machines or losing it at poker tables, and I felt my resolve harden. This wasn't about money, not really. This was about accountability, about refusing to enable destructive behavior, about standing up for myself when no one else would. My parents had made their choice when they decided to steal from me. Now I had to make mine. Marcus helped me draft a formal complaint to submit to my bank's fraud department, documenting every unauthorized transaction and requesting a full investigation. He also connected me with a criminal attorney he'd worked with before, a tough woman named Sarah Martinez who specialized in financial crimes. Sarah agreed to meet with me that afternoon, and Marcus offered to come along for moral support. As we prepared to leave his office, he put a hand on my shoulder and looked me directly in the eyes. "Jess, I need you to understand something," he said seriously. "Once you file these complaints, there's no taking them back. Your relationship with your parents will never be the same, and your family will probably never forgive you for this. Are you absolutely sure this is the path you want to take?" I thought about his question for a long moment, weighing the potential consequences against the alternative of letting my parents get away with stealing from me. "Marcus, they stole my future," I said finally. "They took 5 years of sacrifice and discipline and handed it over to fund Amanda's addiction without even asking me. If I let this slide, what's to stop them from doing it again? What's to stop Amanda from expecting me to bankroll her gambling for the rest of her life?" He nodded, recognizing the determination in my voice, and we headed out to meet with Sarah Martinez. Sarah's law office was in one of Phoenix's gleaming downtown high-rises, the kind of place that screamed competence and success. Sarah herself was exactly what I'd hoped for, a no-nonsense attorney in her 40s who'd built her reputation on holding financial predators accountable. She reviewed my documentation with the same methodical approach Marcus had used, asking pointed questions about my parents' access to the accounts and the timeline of the thefts. When she finished her review, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a frank assessment of my options. "You have an absolutely solid case for criminal prosecution," Sarah said bluntly. "The evidence is clear, the amounts are substantial, and the ongoing pattern of theft shows intent and planning. The district attorney's office will definitely pursue charges if you want to press them. But I need to be honest with you about what that means. Your parents will be arrested, probably within a week of filing charges. They'll be booked, fingerprinted, and released on bail, but it will be public record. Your family will know you're the one who put them in that position." The thought of my parents being arrested because of my actions made my chest tight with anxiety. But Sarah wasn't finished outlining the potential consequences. She explained that criminal prosecution could take months or even years to resolve, during which time my family relationships would be completely destroyed. There would be no going back to Sunday barbecues by the pool, no pretending that everything was fine, no maintaining the comfortable fiction that we were a normal, loving family who just had some financial disagreements. There's also the civil option. You can sue them for the return of your money plus damages without involving criminal prosecution. It's faster, less public, and gives you more control over the outcome. But it's also more expensive up front, and there's no guarantee they actually have the money to pay you back if you win. She explained that civil litigation would still destroy my family relationships, but it would give my parents a chance to make things right without facing potential jail time. As we discussed my options, I found myself thinking about Amanda and wondering where she was at that moment. Was she at Desert Diamond Casino, riding the high of having access to more money than she'd ever gambled with before? Was she already starting to realize that $42,000 wouldn't last as long as she had hoped when feeding a serious addiction? Or was she sitting in some hotel room somewhere, finally understanding the magnitude of what her parents had done to get her this money and feeling sick about the consequences? Part of me wanted to call Amanda directly to confront her about her role in this whole situation, but I knew that would be pointless. Amanda was a master at deflecting responsibility and turning herself into the victim of any conversation. She'd probably claim she had no idea where the money came from, or that she had assumed I'd given it willingly, or that she was planning to pay it all back once she hit a big win. Addicts are incredibly creative when it comes to justifying their actions, and Amanda had years of practice at manipulating family members into supporting her habit. Instead, I decided to focus on what I could control, which was holding my parents accountable for their actions and setting firm boundaries about what I would and wouldn't tolerate going forward. Sarah helped me draft a formal demand letter to my parents, giving them 7 days to return every penny they stole or face both criminal and civil prosecution. The letter was
Cold and professional, laying out exactly what they'd done and what consequences they'd face if they didn't make it right immediately. This letter will make it clear that you're not playing games, Sarah explained as she reviewed the final draft. It gives them a chance to fix this quietly, but it also makes it clear that you're prepared to take serious legal action if they don't cooperate. Sometimes the threat of prosecution is enough to motivate people to do the right thing. I hoped she was right, but I wasn't holding my breath. My parents had already proven they were willing to betray my trust and steal my money. Why would they suddenly develop a conscience now? That evening, I drove to my parents' house in Tempe, the demand letter burning like a live coal in my purse. The house looked exactly the same as it had every other time I'd visited, the desert landscaping neat and well-maintained, the Spanish tile roof glowing in the late afternoon sun. But everything felt different now, like I was approaching enemy territory instead of the place where I'd grown up. I could see my father's car in the driveway, which meant both my parents were home, probably watching their evening news programs and wondering why I hadn't called them back after our disastrous conversation the night before. I rang the doorbell instead of using my key, a small gesture that felt symbolically important. This wasn't my home anymore. I was here as an adversary, someone seeking justice rather than family comfort. My mother answered the door, her face brightening momentarily before she registered my serious expression and formal posture. She was wearing one of her favorite floral blouses, the kind she usually reserved for church or special occasions, and I wondered if she'd dressed up because she was expecting this confrontation. "Jessica, sweetheart, come in," she said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the living room. "Your father and I have been talking, and we think we can work this whole thing out. We don't want there to be any bad feelings between us." Her tone was conciliatory, almost pleading, and I could tell she'd spent the day trying to figure out how to smooth things over without actually acknowledging what they'd done wrong. My father was sitting in his usual recliner, remote control in hand, but he muted the television when he saw me enter the room. Robert Chen had always been a man of few words, preferring to let my mother handle emotional conversations while he provided silent backup. But today he looked older somehow, more fragile than I remembered, and I could see the stress of the situation in the way his shoulders sagged forward. "Dad, Mom, we need to talk about what happens next," I said, remaining standing rather than taking my usual seat on their couch. "What you did was theft, plain and simple. You stole $42,000 from my savings account, plus another $7,000 in smaller transfers over the past few months. That's felony-level crime, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't." My mother's face crumpled at my words, and she sank into her favorite armchair as if her legs couldn't support her weight. "Jessica, you're our daughter. We raised you, we sacrificed for you, we gave you everything you needed to become successful. Doesn't that count for something? Can't you find it in your heart to help your sister when she needs it most?" His words were carefully chosen, designed to trigger my guilt and make me question whether I was being unreasonable in demanding accountability. But I'd spent too many years being manipulated by family guilt trips, and I wasn't going to fall for it again. "Dad, you're not asking me to help Amanda," I replied firmly. You already decided to help her, using my money without consulting me. Now you're asking me to pretend that what you did was okay, and I won't do that. Amanda has a gambling addiction that requires professional treatment, not more money to feed her habit. By giving her access to my savings, you've made her problem worse, not better. My mother looked up from her chair, tears streaming down her face. "We thought you'd understand," she said through her sobs. "Amanda was so desperate, so scared. She said she might hurt herself if she couldn't get help with her debts. What were we supposed to do? Let our daughter suffer when we had access to money that could save her?" It was emotional manipulation at its finest, painting Amanda as a potential suicide risk while casting me as the cold-hearted sister who'd rather see her dead than part with some money. I pulled the demand letter from my purse and set it on the coffee table between us, the official legal header letter making the document look ominous and final. This is a formal demand for the return of my money. All $49,000 returned within 7 days, or I'm filing criminal charges for theft and civil charges for damages. I'm also going to freeze all the accounts you have access to and make sure you can never steal from me again. The reaction was immediate and explosive. My father jumped up from his recliner, his face flushed with anger. "You'd send your own parents to jail over money? What kind of daughter are we raised? What happened to family loyalty, to taking care of each other?" My mother's sobs grew louder, and she began rocking back and forth in her chair like a child having a tantrum. "The kind of daughter who won't enable destructive behavior," I replied steadily, despite the chaos erupting around me. "The kind of daughter who understands that real love sometimes means saying no, even when it's difficult. You didn't help Amanda by giving me my money. You fed her addiction and guaranteed that she'll need even more money next month and the month after that until she's destroyed everyone who loves her." My father moved closer to me, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might actually try to physically intimidate me, but he stopped just short of my personal space. "We are your parents," he said through gritted teeth. "We brought you into this world. We fed you, we clothed you, we paid for your education. You owe us respect and you owe us loyalty. Is this how you repay us for everything we've done?" The guilt trip might have worked on the old Jessica, the compliant daughter, who always tried to keep the peace and make everyone happy. But the new Jessica, the one who'd had her entire life savings stolen by the people who claimed to love her most, wasn't buying it anymore. "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly. "Being a parent doesn't give you the right to steal from your children. Raising me and providing for me when I was a child was your responsibility, not a favor you did me that I need to repay for the rest of my life." The conversation continued for another hour, going in circles as my parents alternated between anger and self-pity, trying every emotional manipulation technique they'd perfected over the years. They accused me of being selfish, materialistic, and ungrateful. They claimed I was tearing the family apart over money that didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. They suggested that I was jealous of Amanda and using this situation to finally get revenge on the sister who'd always outshone me. But none of their arguments addressed the fundamental issue, which was that they'd committed a crime against me and showed no remorse for their actions. They wanted me to focus on their intentions rather than their behavior, to forgive and forget without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing or commitment to making things right. They wanted to maintain their position as the wise, loving parents while treating me like a selfish child who needed to be talked out of her unreasonable demands. When I finally left their house that evening, the demand letter still sitting on their coffee table like an unexploded bomb, I felt emotionally drained but strangely liberated. I'd drawn a line in the sand, established boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences. My parents now knew exactly where they stood and what would happen if they chose not to cooperate. The next move was theirs, but I was prepared for whatever they decided to do. That night, I sat in my apartment trying to imagine what life would look like after this was all resolved. Would I ever have a relationship with my parents again? Or would this be the final break between us? Would Amanda eventually understand that what I was doing was actually an attempt to help her? Or would she see me as the villain who destroyed her safety net? Would the rest of my extended family take sides, forcing me to choose between justice and maintaining connections with cousins, aunts, and uncles who might not understand the full situation? The questions were overwhelming, but one thing was crystal clear.
I couldn't go back to being the family doormat, the reliable daughter who could always be counted on to sacrifice her own well-being for everyone else's comfort. That version of Jessica had died the moment I saw my bank balance drop to zero, and what was emerging in her place was someone stronger, someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. 7 days suddenly felt like a very long time to wait for my parents' response. But I knew the next week would determine not just whether I got my money back, but whether my family had any chance of surviving this crisis intact. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. Because for the first time in my life, I was fighting for myself instead of against myself. The 7-day deadline I'd given my parents felt like an eternity, each day stretching endlessly as I waited for some sign that they understood the gravity of what they'd done. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, picking up extra shifts at Phoenix General and volunteering for the most challenging cases in the cardiac unit. There was something therapeutic about focusing on other people's medical crises, problems that had clear solutions and predictable outcomes. Unlike my family situation, heart surgery followed logical protocols. You identified the problem, you fixed it, and the patient either recovered or they didn't. There were no emotional manipulations or guilt trips involved, just medical science and professional competence. My colleagues noticed the change in my behavior, the way I stayed late to complete documentation that could have waited until the next shift, the way I volunteered for overtime when other nurses were trying to get home to their families. Patricia Gonzalez, one of the senior nurses I'd worked with for 3 years, cornered me during a coffee break on my 4th day of waiting for my parents' response. Patricia had a reputation for being direct, a skill she'd developed during 20 years of dealing with difficult doctors and anxious family members. "Jess, what's going on with you?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me in the break room. "You're working like someone's chasing you with a stick, and you look like you haven't slept in a week. Are you having money problems? Relationship issues?" Her concern was genuine, and I found myself wanting to confide in her, but the story felt too complicated and too raw to share with a work colleague, even one I respected as much as Patricia. "Just some family stuff," I said vaguely, hoping she'd let it drop. But Patricia had raised 4 children and managed to put 2 of them through college while working full-time as a nurse. She had a finely tuned radar for detecting when someone was in serious trouble, and she wasn't easily discouraged from trying to help. She leaned forward, lowering her voice so our conversation wouldn't carry to the other nurses scattered around the break room. "Jess, family stuff that's making you work doubles every day and look like you're about to collapse from exhaustion?" She pressed gently. "Honey, I've been doing this job long enough to know that whatever's eating at you is going to affect your patient care eventually. You can't run on adrenaline and coffee forever. What's really going on?" The kindness in her voice almost broke my composure, and I felt tears threatening for the first time since I'd discovered the theft. I ended up telling Patricia the entire story, from Amanda's gambling addiction to my parents' betrayal to the demand letter I'd delivered 3 days earlier. She listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I detailed the extent of the financial theft and the complete breakdown of trust within my family. When I finished talking, she sat back in her chair and shook her head slowly, the way she did when a patient's family members were being unreasonable about treatment decisions. "Jesus, Jess, your own parents stole your life savings to enable your sister's gambling? That's not family drama, that's criminal behavior. Have you thought about pressing charges?" Her matter-of-fact tone made me realize that people outside my family would see this situation much more clearly than I had been able to. To Patricia, this wasn't a complex moral dilemma about family loyalty versus personal boundaries. This was simply a case of theft that deserved legal consequences. "I've got a lawyer," I admitted. "We're giving them 7 days to return the money before we file criminal charges. But Patricia, these are my parents, the people who raised me, who taught me right from wrong. How do I send them to jail?" The question had been haunting me for days, creating a constant knot of anxiety in my chest that made it difficult to eat or sleep properly. Patricia reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her expression gentle but firm. "Sweetie, people who taught you right from wrong wouldn't steal from you. They wouldn't take your life savings to enable an addiction. Real parents protect their children."
Children's futures. They don't sacrifice them for short-term fixes. You're not sending them to jail. They sent themselves to jail the moment they decided to commit a felony against their own daughter. Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were absolutely true. I'd been so focused on my guilt about potentially destroying my family that I'd lost sight of the fact that my family had already been destroyed by my parents' actions. They'd made the choice to cross that line, to violate my trust and steal my money. All I was doing was refusing to pretend that their crime was acceptable family behavior. That evening, I decided to drive past Amanda's old house in Chandler, the place she'd shared with Derek before their marriage imploded. I wasn't sure what I'd hoped to accomplish, but I needed to understand the full scope of the damage Amanda's addiction had caused. The house was a modest ranch-style home in a middle-class subdivision, the kind of place where young families put down roots and plan their futures. There was a for sale sign in the front yard, and I could see through the windows that the rooms were empty, stripped of all the furniture and personal belongings that had once made it a home. I sat in my car across the street, staring at the empty house and trying to imagine Amanda and Derek during their happier years. They'd hosted Thanksgiving dinner there 2 years ago, back when we'd all still believed Amanda's gambling was just a harmless hobby. Derek had been proud of the renovations he'd done to the kitchen, showing off the new granite countertops and stainless steel appliances he'd installed himself. Amanda had seemed genuinely happy that day, laughing at Derek's jokes and talking excitedly about their plans to start a family. But addiction has a way of poisoning everything it touches, turning love into suspicion and trust into surveillance. Derek had probably spent the final months of their marriage wondering what Amanda was really doing during her girls' nights out, checking bank statements for unauthorized withdrawals, and feeling like he was living with a stranger who wore his wife's face. The divorce papers I'd seen through family gossip painted a picture of financial devastation, with Amanda having racked up over $60,000 in secret debts across multiple credit cards and personal loans. As I drove home that night, I found myself wondering where Amanda was staying now. My parents had mentioned she'd moved back in with them temporarily, but Amanda was a proud woman who'd always valued her independence. Living in her childhood bedroom at age 33, dependent on parents who were now facing potential criminal charges because of her actions, must have been a special kind of hell for someone with her personality. Part of me wondered if she was beginning to understand the true cost of her addiction, not just to herself, but to everyone who loved her. The 5th day of waiting brought an unexpected phone call from my Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister who lived in Tucson. Helen had always been the family peacemaker, the one who smoothed over holiday disagreements and mediated disputes between relatives. Her voice was carefully neutral when she called, but I could hear the underlying tension as she launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about family unity and forgiveness. "Jessica, your parents are beside themselves with worry," Helen began, her tone gently chiding. "Your mother called me crying yesterday, saying you're threatening to have them arrested over some money issues. Surely this is something the family can work out privately, without involving lawyers and police officers. What would your grandmother think if she knew her family was falling apart like this?" The invocation of my deceased grandmother was a low blow, a deliberate attempt to trigger my guilt by suggesting that my actions would disappoint someone I'd loved dearly. My grandmother had been a kind, gentle woman who'd survived incredible hardship during her early years in America, working multiple jobs to support her family while learning English and adapting to a new culture. But she'd also been a woman who understood the value of hard work and personal responsibility, someone who would never have tolerated the kind of financial theft my parents had committed. "Aunt Helen, did my parents tell you exactly what they did?" I asked, keeping my voice steady as I got lectured about family values by someone who didn't understand the full situation. "Did they mention that they stole $49,000 from my savings account to give to Amanda for gambling money? Did they explain that this wasn't the first time they've taken money from my accounts without permission?" The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for me to wonder if Helen had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Jessica, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Your parents love you and Amanda equally. They would never steal from you. There must be some explanation that makes sense of all this.
Them from the consequences of their actions. But the truth had a way of coming out eventually, and when it did, their carefully constructed story would collapse like a house of cards. On the 6th day, I received a text message from Amanda herself, the first direct communication I'd had with my sister since discovering the theft. The message was brief and predictably manipulative, hitting all the emotional buttons Amanda had learned to push over the years. Jess, I know you're angry, but please don't destroy our family over money. I'm getting help for my problems, and I swear I'll pay you back every penny. Don't let lawyers and police officers tear us apart when we should be supporting each other through this difficult time. The message was classic Amanda, acknowledging just enough responsibility to seem contrite, while simultaneously minimizing the severity of what had happened and deflecting blame onto external forces. She was getting help for her problems, but she didn't specify what kind of help or provide any concrete evidence that she was actually addressing her gambling addiction. She promised to pay me back, but she didn't explain where she'd get $49,000 when she'd already lost her job, her house, and her marriage to gambling debts. Most tellingly, she referred to the situation as something that was happening to our family rather than something she and my parents had done to me. I stared at the message for a long time, crafting and deleting dozens of potential responses. Part of me wanted to call Amanda immediately and demand to know where my money was, whether she'd already gambled it all away or if there was still time to recover some of it. Another part of me wanted to pour out years of frustration and disappointment to finally tell Amanda exactly what her addiction had cost not just me, but everyone who loved her. But I knew that engaging with Amanda directly would only give her another opportunity to manipulate me, to twist the conversation around until somehow I was the one apologizing for being upset about having my life savings stolen. Instead, I forwarded Amanda's message to Sarah Martinez with a brief note asking if it constituted any kind of legal admission or if it might be useful as evidence. Sarah called me back within an hour, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she analyzed Amanda's text. "This is actually perfect," Sarah explained. "She's acknowledging that she received money that belongs to you, and she's promising to pay it back, which is essentially an admission that the money was taken improperly. If your parents try to claim they had permission to transfer your funds, Amanda's own words contradict that defense." Sarah also pointed out that Amanda's promise to pay back the money was legally meaningless without a concrete repayment plan and timeline. "Anyone can promise to pay back stolen money," Sarah noted dryly, "but promises don't restore your savings account or compensate you for the financial damage you've suffered. If Amanda really wanted to make this right, she'd be working with a reputable treatment program and providing documentation of her recovery efforts, not sending vague text messages about getting help." The 7th day arrived with an email from my father, formal and businesslike, in a way that felt completely unlike his usual communication style. The subject line read, "Regarding recent financial disagreements," and the tone of the message suggested he'd probably had help writing it, possibly from a lawyer or financial advisor. The email acknowledged that money had been transferred from my accounts, but characterized it as a family loan rather than theft, claiming they'd intended to discuss repayment terms with me before I'd overreacted to the situation. My father's email offered to return $25,000 immediately and establish a payment plan for the remaining $24,000 spread out over 3 years with modest interest. He emphasized their fixed income as retirees and suggested that demanding full immediate repayment would cause them serious financial hardship. The email concluded with an appeal to my compassion and a request that we handle this matter within the family rather than involving outside authorities who wouldn't understand our close relationships and shared history. The offer was insulting on multiple levels, starting with the characterization of theft as a loan and continuing with the suggestion that I was somehow being unreasonable by demanding the return of my own money. My father was essentially asking me to finance my parents' crime, allowing them to keep half of what they'd stolen while making token payments on the remainder over 3 years.
There was no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology for violating my trust, and no recognition that their actions had caused me serious financial and emotional harm. I forwarded the email to Sarah Martinez and called her immediately to discuss our response. Sarah's reaction was swift and unforgiving. "They're not taking this seriously," she said bluntly. "This email proves they think they can negotiate their way out of criminal liability while keeping most of your money. It's time to file charges, Jessica. They've had their chance to make this right, and they've chosen to treat it like a business transaction rather than acknowledging that they committed a serious crime." That afternoon, Sarah and I met at the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit to file formal charges against my parents. The detective assigned to the case, a middle-aged woman named Detective Rodriguez, reviewed my documentation with professional efficiency. She'd handled hundreds of similar cases over her career, and she wasn't surprised by the family dynamics involved. "Financial abuse by family members is more common than people think," she explained as she took my statement. "Usually it's adult children stealing from elderly parents, but we see cases like yours too, where parents abuse their access to adult children's accounts." Detective Rodriguez explained that the investigation would move quickly given the clear paper trail and substantial evidence I'd provided. "Your parents will be contacted within 48 hours and asked to come in for questioning. They'll have the opportunity to provide their side of the story, but based on what you've shown me, I expect we'll be filing formal charges within a week. Are you prepared for what that means for your family relationships?" The question was one I'd been asking myself for days, but hearing it from a police detective made the consequences feel immediate and real. Within a week, my parents would likely be arrested and charged with multiple felonies. Their names would appear in court records and possibly local news reports. My extended family would learn about the situation, and I'd probably be painted as the ungrateful daughter who destroyed their parents' golden years over money.
Comfortable fiction that we were a normal, loving family would be shattered permanently, replaced by the ugly reality of criminal prosecution and broken trust. But as I sat in Detective Rodriguez's office, signing official statements and providing additional documentation, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. This wasn't about money, and it wasn't about revenge. This was about accountability, about refusing to enable destructive behavior, about standing up for myself when no one else would. My parents had made their choice when they decided to steal from me. Amanda had made her choice when she accepted money she knew didn't belong to her. Now I was making my choice, and for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing to prioritize my own well-being over my family's comfort. That evening, I called Marcus to update him on the day's events. He listened quietly as I described filing the police report and the likely timeline for charges being filed. When I finished talking, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Jess, I'm proud of you," he said simply. "I know this can't have been easy, but you did the right thing. Your parents need to face consequences for what they did. And Amanda needs to understand that her actions have real costs for the people who love her." Marcus also offered practical advice about protecting my remaining assets and rebuilding my financial security. "You're going to need to change all your banking passwords and remove your parents' access to any accounts they might still be able to reach," he advised. "You should also consider freezing your credit reports to make sure they can't open any new accounts in your name. Trust but verify, as they say, but in your case, maybe just skip the trust part for a while." That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything that had happened over the past week. 7 days earlier, I'd been a daughter trying to preserve family relationships while seeking justice for a serious crime. Now, I was a crime victim who'd chosen legal accountability over family harmony, with police detectives investigating my own parents for theft. The transformation felt both devastating and liberating, like burning down a house that had become too damaged to repair. I thought about Amanda, wherever she was at that moment,
and wondered if she understood that the money she'd received had cost her the last functional relationship in her family. I thought about my parents, probably lying awake in their bed, finally beginning to understand that their actions would have serious legal consequences. And I thought about myself, about the woman I was becoming, someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it, even when the cost was everything she'd once believed about family loyalty and unconditional love. The next few weeks would bring criminal charges, family drama, and probably months of legal proceedings. But for the first time since discovering the theft, I felt like I was moving forward rather than being dragged along by other people's bad decisions. The scared, confused daughter who'd discovered her empty bank account was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more self-aware. That transformation alone was worth more than any amount of money my parents could have stolen. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, 2 days after I'd filed the police report. I was getting ready for an early shift at Phoenix General when my phone rang with an unknown number. Detective Rodriguez's voice was calm and professional, but I could hear the satisfaction underlying her words. "Jessica, we've made arrests in your case. Your parents were taken into custody an hour ago at their residence. They're being processed now and will be arraigned later today." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting this outcome. Knowing intellectually that your parents are going to be arrested is completely different from hearing that they're actually sitting in a jail cell being fingerprinted and photographed like common criminals. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the weight of what I'd set in motion crushing down on my chest. These were the people who'd taught me to ride a bicycle, who'd attended every school play and graduation ceremony, who'd proudly displayed my nursing school diploma on their refrigerator. Now they were facing felony charges because of evidence I'd provided to law enforcement. Detective Rodriguez continued with the details, explaining that both my parents had been charged with grand theft in the first degree and conspiracy to commit fraud. The bail hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and she expected they'd be released on their own recognizance, given their age and lack of prior criminal history. The district attorney's office is taking this case seriously. The evidence is solid, and the pattern of theft shows clear intent. Your parents are looking at potential prison time if convicted. Prison time. The phrase echoed in my head as I hung up the phone and stared at myself in my bathroom mirror. My parents, who'd never received so much as a speeding ticket in their entire lives, were facing the possibility of spending their golden years behind bars because they decided my life savings belonged to Amanda more than it belonged to me. The irony was devastating. They'd committed these crimes to help Amanda avoid the consequences of her gambling addiction, but all they'd accomplished was ensuring that the entire family would face consequences none of us could have imagined. I called in sick to work again, something that was becoming a troubling pattern, and drove aimlessly around Phoenix while trying to process what had just happened. The city looked different somehow, as if the arrest of my parents had fundamentally altered the landscape around me. I found myself in neighborhoods I'd never visited before, past strip malls and office complexes that held no memories or associations with my family. There was something comforting about being surrounded by strangers who had no knowledge of my situation, people going about their daily lives without any awareness that my world had just collapsed and rebuilt itself in the span of a single phone call. My phone started ringing around 10 in the morning, a constant stream of calls from family members who'd heard about the arrests through the network of gossip and speculation that binds extended families together. I let most of them go to voicemail, not ready to deal with the inevitable accusations and demands for explanations. The few messages I did listen to ranged from shocked disbelief to outright anger, with most relatives expressing some version of, "How could you do this to your own parents?" But it was Amanda's call, finally returned after days of silence, that cut the deepest. Her voice was shaky and tear-filled, but underneath the emotion was the familiar tone of manipulation that had characterized our relationship for years. "Jessica, what have you done?"
She sobbed into the phone. "Mom and Dad are in jail because of you. They're old, they're scared, and they don't deserve this. How could you be so cruel to the people who raised us?" The accusation was so fundamentally backwards that it took my breath away. Amanda was talking as if I'd committed some unprovoked attack against innocent victims, rather than seeking justice for a serious crime committed against me. She'd completely inverted the reality of the situation, casting herself and our parents as the victims, while painting me as the villain who destroyed our family out of spite or greed. "Amanda, they stole $49,000 from my savings account to give you gambling money," I said slowly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "They committed multiple felonies against their own daughter to enable your addiction. They destroyed our family the moment they decided your casino debts were more important than my financial future." But Amanda wasn't interested in acknowledging reality. She launched into a familiar litany of excuses and deflections, claiming she had no idea where the money came from, insisting she'd assumed I'd given it willingly, promising that she was getting treatment and would pay back every penny once she got back on her feet. It was the same script she'd been reciting for years, with minor variations depending on the specific crisis she was trying to escape. "You could have just talked to me," Amanda continued, her voice rising with indignation. "We could have worked something out as a family, without involving lawyers and police officers. But instead, you chose to destroy everything we had together. Mom and Dad are going to die in prison because their youngest daughter decided money was more important than love." The emotional manipulation was so blatant, it was almost impressive. Amanda was simultaneously claiming ignorance about the theft while also arguing that I should have negotiated with her about returning my own money. She was positioning herself as the reasonable family member who wanted to find solutions, while casting me as the vindictive sister who preferred legal warfare to family harmony. Most insidiously, she was predicting our parents' deaths in prison, a dramatic flourish designed to make me feel responsible for any negative consequences they might face. I hung up on Amanda without responding to her accusations, my hands shaking with a combination of anger and grief. The conversation had crystallized something important for me. The realization that Amanda would never take responsibility for her role in this disaster. She would never acknowledge that her gambling addiction had created the crisis that led our parents to steal from me. She would never admit that accepting money she knew belonged to someone else was morally wrong, regardless of her desperate circumstances. In Amanda's version of reality, she was always the victim of other people's decisions, never the architect of her own destruction. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and emotional processing. Sarah Martinez called to discuss the implications of the arrests and the likely timeline for the criminal case. She explained that my parents would probably plead not guilty initially, hoping to negotiate a plea bargain that would reduce their potential sentences. The district attorney might offer them a deal involving restitution, probation, and community service, but that will depend on whether they're willing to acknowledge what they did and show genuine remorse. Sarah also warned me that the criminal case could take months to resolve, during which time my family relationships would remain in a state of toxic limbo. Your parents' lawyer will probably try to paint you as vindictive and money-obsessed. They'll argue that this was a family matter that should have been handled privately, not a criminal case worthy of prosecution. You need to be prepared for character assassination designed to make you seem like the villain in this story. That afternoon, I received a call from Marcus with news that provided some hope for financial recovery. The bank had completed their investigation of the unauthorized transfers and had agreed to restore $15,000 to my account, acknowledging that my parents' access should have been terminated after my medical emergency the previous year. It wasn't the full amount I'd lost, but it was enough to begin rebuilding my emergency fund and moving forward with my life.
The bank is also implementing new security protocols to prevent this kind of abuse in the future. They're requiring additional verification for large transfers and automatic termination of emergency access after 90 days. Your case has actually helped them identify weaknesses in their system that could have affected other customers. The knowledge that my experience might prevent other families from going through similar betrayals provided some small comfort, but it couldn't erase the fundamental damage that had been done to my relationships and my sense of security. I'd spent years building trust with my parents, believing that they had my best interests at heart even when they made decisions I didn't agree with. That trust had been shattered irreparably. Not just by their theft, but by their complete refusal to acknowledge the wrongness of their actions. Over the following weeks, as the criminal case moved through the legal system, I began making plans for a complete fresh start. The $15,000 from the bank, combined with some additional savings I'd accumulated in checking accounts my parents hadn't accessed, gave me enough capital to consider relocating to a different city where I could build a new life free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my family relationships. I'd always been drawn to Austin, Texas, a city known for its vibrant music scene, progressive culture, and growing healthcare industry. The idea of starting over in a place where no one knew my history, where I could be Jessica the nurse rather than Jessica the daughter who had sent their parents to jail, was incredibly appealing. I began researching job opportunities at Austin's major hospitals and looking at apartment listings in neighborhoods that seemed to match my personality and budget. The decision to leave Phoenix wasn't just about escaping my family drama, though that was certainly a factor. It was about reclaiming my identity as an independent adult who made decisions based on her own values and priorities rather than constantly managing other people's crises and expectations. For too many years, I'd defined myself in relation to other people's needs, always playing the responsible daughter or the supportive sister, rather than figuring out who I was when I wasn't fixing someone else's problems. My last day at Phoenix General was bittersweet, filled with goodbye lunches,
Promises to stay in touch with colleagues who'd become genuine friends over the years. Patricia Gonzalez pulled me aside during my final shift, her expression serious but proud. "You're doing the right thing, Jess," she said firmly. "Getting away from that toxic situation is the best thing you can do for yourself. Your family made their choices, and now you're making yours." Patricia also shared some wisdom she'd gained from her own experience dealing with family addiction issues. Addiction doesn't just destroy the addict, she explained. It destroys everyone around them who enables the behavior or tries to manage the consequences. By refusing to participate in that dynamic anymore, you're not just protecting yourself, you're also removing one of the support systems that allows the addiction to continue. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step away. The criminal case was still pending when I loaded my belongings into a moving truck and drove east toward Austin. My parents had hired an expensive defense attorney who was trying to negotiate a plea bargain that would avoid prison time, but Sarah Martinez had made it clear that any deal would require full restitution of the stolen money and acknowledgement of guilt. "They can't negotiate their way out of the consequences," Sarah had explained during our final meeting. "They committed serious crimes, and the justice system is going to hold them accountable whether they like it or not." I'd left my contact information with Sarah and Detective Rodriguez, but I'd also made it clear that I wouldn't be returning to Phoenix for family reconciliation attempts or emotional manipulation campaigns. The legal system would handle the criminal charges, and I was moving forward with my life, regardless of how my parents chose to deal with their situation. Austin welcomed me with warm weather, friendly people, and a job offer at Dell Children's Medical Center that seemed almost too good to be true. The pediatric unit was different from the cardiac care I'd been doing in Phoenix, but the work was engaging and meaningful in ways that reminded me why I'd chosen nursing as a career. My new colleagues were supportive and professional, and none of them knew anything about my family history beyond the basic facts I chose to share. I found an apartment in South Austin, a trendy neighborhood filled with young professionals, musicians, and artists who appreciated authenticity and individual expression. My neighbors were friendly but respectful of boundaries, offering help when needed but not prying into personal business. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe freely. make decisions based on my own preferences rather than family obligations, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than genetic accidents. 6 months after leaving Phoenix, I received a call from Sarah Martinez with news about the criminal case. My parents had finally accepted a plea bargain that included felony convictions, 3 years of supervised probation, and an order to pay full restitution of the stolen money. They'd avoided prison time, but their criminal records would follow them for the rest of their lives, affecting everything from housing applications to volunteer opportunities. They also had to admit guilt in open court, Sarah explained with satisfaction in her voice. Your father read a statement acknowledging that they'd stolen your money without permission and expressing regret for their actions. It wasn't the most heartfelt apology I've ever heard, but it was an official acknowledgement of what they did wrong. The restitution payments would be spread over 2 years, with monthly installments that would gradually restore my stolen savings. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than the informal family loan my father had initially proposed. More importantly, it represented official recognition that what they'd done was a crime, deserving legal consequences, not a family misunderstanding that could be resolved with good intentions and time. Amanda had apparently moved to Las Vegas, probably attracted by the city's gambling opportunities and distance from family scrutiny. I'd heard through the extended family network that she'd enrolled in a treatment program, but I'd also heard rumors that she'd been banned from several major casinos for erratic behavior. Recovery from gambling addiction was a long and difficult process, and Amanda would have to want sobriety more than she wanted the thrill of risking everything on the next bet. I chose not to maintain contact with any of them, a decision that some relatives criticize, but most eventually came to understand. Aunt Helen called occasionally to check on my well-being and provide updates about my parents' adjustment to life with criminal records, but she respected my boundaries about not wanting to rebuild relationships that had been fundamentally poisoned by betrayal and manipulation. Instead, I focused on building new relationships with people who shared my values and respected my boundaries. I joined a hiking group that explored the beautiful Texas hill country on weekends, started taking photography classes to pursue a creative hobby I'd always been interested in, and even began dating again after years of being too emotionally exhausted by family drama to invest in romantic relationships. One evening, almost a year after leaving Phoenix, I was sitting on my apartment balcony watching the sunset paint the Austin skyline in shades of orange and purple, when I realized that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anxious about money or family obligations. My savings account was growing steadily again, funded by honest work and careful budgeting, rather than constant depletion to cover other people's mistakes. My phone didn't ring constantly with crisis calls and guilt trips. My weekends were my own, filled with activities I chose based on my interests rather than family obligations. The transformation wasn't just financial or geographical. I'd fundamentally changed as a person, evolving from someone who defined herself through service to others into someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to protect it. The scared, confused daughter who discovered her empty bank account had been replaced by a confident woman who made decisions based on her own values and priorities. I still thought about my family sometimes, wondering if my parents had learned anything from their criminal convictions or if Amanda had managed to get her addiction under control. But those thoughts no longer carried the weight of obligation or guilt that had once defined my relationship with their problems. They were adults who'd made choices and faced consequences, just as I was an adult who'd made different choices and was living with different consequences. The money they'd stolen had been important, representing years of sacrifice and planning for my future. But what they'd really taken was my naivete about family loyalty and unconditional love. In return, they'd given me
something more valuable than any bank balance. The understanding that I deserve to be treated with respect and honesty, even by the people who claim to love me most. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from people who take your kindness for weakness and your love for granted. Sometimes protecting yourself requires disappointing others who've grown comfortable with your willingness to sacrifice your own well-being for their convenience. And sometimes the family you choose for yourself is healthier and more supportive than the family you were born into. I never did buy that house I'd been saving for in Phoenix. Instead, I used my restored savings and the money from my parents' restitution payments to put a down payment on a small condo in Austin, a place that was truly mine in every sense of the word. It wasn't the dream home I'd originally planned, but it represented something more valuable than real estate. It represented freedom, independence, and the hard-won knowledge that I was worth protecting, even when the people who should have protected me chose not to. The last time I spoke to Amanda was through a text message she sent on my birthday, 2 years after I'd left Phoenix. It was a brief note wishing me well and mentioning that she'd been sober from gambling for 6 months. I was genuinely happy to hear about her progress, but I didn't respond to the message. Recovery was something Amanda had to do for herself, not for the family members she'd hurt along the way. My role in her story was finished, just as her role in mine had ended the day I chose accountability over enablement. As I settled into my new life in Austin, surrounded by people who respected my boundaries and appreciated my strengths, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. It had started with the devastating discovery of theft and betrayal, continued through months of legal proceedings and family drama, and culminated in a complete transformation of my identity and priorities. The scared daughter who'd been afraid to disappoint her parents was gone, replaced by a confident woman who understood that real love requires honesty, respect, and accountability. My parents had thought they were helping Amanda by stealing my money, but what they'd really done was teach all of us that actions have consequences, that trust once broken is nearly impossible to repair, and that family bonds aren't strong enough to survive fundamental violations of respect and honesty. It wasn't the lesson they'd intended to teach, but it was the lesson I needed to learn to become the person I was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.